we had another Achilles injury on MetLife turf.
Right.
And that had, some Miami Dolphins players talking about it. Javon Holland, I think, was the latest guy to sort of trash that MetLife turf. And I don't want to get too far into just trashing the MetLife turf, but I was curious whether, because that was one where you had a great slow-mo replay of exactly what happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was nothing. He just pushed off, to start his pass rush, and his Achilles just snapped, right?
Yep.
Can turf affect that? Because as far as I could tell, like, there was no slip or anything. There was no obvious give in the turf. So the only thing that can possibly have affected it is like the hardness of the turf, how much it gives, how much padding is underneath it relative to grass or, a different surface or whatever.
Right.
But if that's the case, I mean, does that kind of thing affect Achilles injuries or Achilles likelihoods? And if that's the case, does like basketball have a way higher Achilles tear rate than football because, it's hardcore?
Yeah, I think the terminology that is universally used by NFL players on turf is sticky. The word sticky. They feel like they can't get that give, their cleat sticks. You and I, after talking a little bit, I think are on the same page where I look at a play like Jalen Phillips or something like that, and you don't see why his Achilles would have snapped on that given just a normal planting of his back foot, or like a Cam Akers when he stepped backward. It looked like a routine play.
That feels like the kind of play where, I mean, there are times where you're not going to want your cleat to get stuck in the turf, right? Where your leg is going in a weird direction, the fact that it sticks is bad. That seems like an instance where you actually want your foot to be rock solid. Like, the less it moves, the more it's firing force through the rest of you, which is the whole point in pushing off to explode into your first step.
Yep. And I might be on the opposite side of a lot of medical professionals when it comes to this, but I have a hard time sitting there pointing out an injury like those two that we just talked about saying that's the turf's fault. It more seems like if it was going to happen there, it was bound to happen. And I think that it's just the way that his foot planted and the way that the pressure went through his Achilles tendon, not because his foot was planted into turf. It was just that angle, that mechanism. That's how his Achilles popped. But I do also think that the turf does play a significant role in lower extremity non-contact injuries versus grass. I think that it's just the biggest debate is like, what can you blame on turf versus what is just going to be somebody's physiological response to the way they took off out of their 3-point stance.
Does a sport like basketball have a higher instance in Achilles injuries? Like, is the actual hardness of whatever it is you're pushing off relevant to whether or not your Achilles is just going to tap out one day?
Yes, it does. But again, the ways that players take off in like basketball is nothing like what you have the stop and start of football, where it's from 0 to 100 in a 5-yard sprint. So the role that the Achilles takes in a basketball is a little bit different. I mean, obviously the surface itself is way harder,
right?
But the role that the Achilles plays in basketball is not as used for like a sudden 100% tension load versus where basketball, a lot of times Achilles injuries come when somebody lands and they land awkwardly and that pressure goes down through their foot.
I would imagine, just in relative terms as well, the body types in basketball are less harsh on something like your Achilles.
Right.
Like, some of these football players are loading like a disproportionate volume of muscle weight through that same tendon, as opposed to a basketball player who are, Shaq aside, all like fairly thin, lithe, in proportion human beings, even if they're massive. Right? Like, they're 6'8", but they're 6'8" and skinny, as opposed to 6'8" and loaded with 290 pounds of muscle.
And without, squatting 500 pounds versus squatting 100 pounds. Like,
right.
There's a lot of different variables that go into it. I mean, that being said, though, I don't look at like a football player like who tears his ACL or his Achilles tendon on turf to sit there and say, well, it's because of all these factors of how strong they are and how much they weigh. I do think that there is a role that just the surface level, the playing surface makes a big difference for these players. I mean, they continuously report on how they want to play on grass field. I mean, and obviously with you being an ex-athlete and myself, like I feel a difference. I know a difference between turf and grass, and just the toll it takes on their body. So I understand where the players are coming from here.
Yeah, I mean, every turf I've played on feels horrible. If I given the choice, you would obviously want to play on grass. Now, I think grass has negatives as well. Like there are turf surfaces where simply cutting and stuff feels way better because you can stick your foot in the ground, it will stick, and you can make as hard a cut as you want,
Right.
and know that it's going to be like your foot is going to be there. Whereas in grass, there are times where you stick your foot in the grass and it's just like slips right out from underneath you, and you see that like anytime there's a game on grass, you see just constant slipping, players falling, like players not being able to keep their footing. So like there's a downside to it as well, but it does feel way better just in terms of impact and like the wear and tear that you would get off a grass surface.
Well,
like
absolutely.
I can never figure out how, I mean, forget like they're way better now than they used to be, but you ever see those games of kind of old school AstroTurf where it's like a carpet on concrete?
Yeah.
I mean, how players ever played on that stuff is insane.
It's like rubber on a slab of concrete.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, how you could ever like be driven into that and then get up and, you know, play the next down or whatever is absolutely insane.
Yeah. Yeah. And like then, you know, it kind of reminded me of Lamar Jackson a couple weeks ago. I felt like he couldn't stay on his feet. He was slipping so much on grass. So there is a difference there. You know, there's so many interesting things that are coming out with this debate of turf and grass. And one of the fascinating things that I find is that like the really trusted research studies, like I'm talking about the, you know, Journal of American Sports Medicine, they even find, not only across football, but across all sports, that there's a higher rate of ankle and knee injuries on turf. But the NFL comes out and they did this big push towards, well, it's not necessarily statistically different, because in 2021, there wasn't a huge increase or difference between turf and grass. So they mark that year, and they're, you know, blowing that out in their studies and their articles, saying, well, there's not really a big difference. But just the following year, there was a major difference between injuries on turf and grass. So I'm kind of now like seeing what the NFLPA is putting out there, and they're kind of doing more long-term research. And another study basically said that there's a 16% more chance of injuries on turf than there is grass. So the NFLPA is kind of diving in a little bit deeper. So I'm interested to see what kind of comes out from all of this.
And is the general theory that it's that stickiness, the fact that your foot, your cleat is going to get caught more on turf than it is on grass, that is supposed to be causing the more injuries, or is it the hardness under the surface that is the issue, or a combination of all of it?
I think it's more towards like the stickiness and the lack of give. So in order to define something through the NFL Association and the NFLPA, they define a turf-related or surface-related injury as a non-contact lower extremity injury.
Right.
So ACL tears that happen because of somebody getting hit below the waist, that doesn't count. But when you break it down like that, where it's non-contact, normally what ends up happening is the player's foot will stick, and then their upper knee or their calf or something like that has too much pressure applied to it, and then they have a tear or they have a sprain. And that's where you start to see some of these injuries increase on turf versus grass.
Because you would think like it's almost counterintuitive in that when you're sort of thinking of non-contact injuries in particular, you would think like the times where you slip would be when something could go wrong, right? Mm-hmm. You slip, you roll an ankle, or you slip and your knee is in a weird joint, weird angle when weight goes through it, but actually it's the reverse. It's the time where it sticks unusually, and weight goes through it that
where
causes
you would,
more problems.
Exactly, where you'd almost want a little bit more give under your foot to kind of absorb that shock. And I just find it funny because even, you know, I'm not the biggest soccer fan, but the World Cup being played in the United States, when they come out and say they refuse for their players to play on turf, they have to play on a hybrid field. I mean, that's a industry in itself that does enormous amounts of study for injuries, and they're even claiming that they want, you know, artificial, you know, hybrid turf, kind of like what Lambeau Field has, right? They have the artificial grass and turf combination. Well, they're usually lower on the injury list when it comes to their playing surface, and you know, they kind of are that team that, or that stadium that takes out the excuse of like, well, we can't grow grass anywhere. Well, in Lambeau Field, you're playing in -10 and you're playing in 100 degrees. So I guess it doesn't really matter.